Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the next in the series of panels organized by the Petroyatsik Program for the Study of Contemporary Ukraine at the University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs at the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies. My name is Marta Dichok. I am at the University of Western Ontario, or Western University as we've been rebranded, and also a member of the coordinating committee of the Yatsik program at the University of Toronto. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to this panel on churches and the Russian war on Ukraine, organized by Professor Yaroslav Skira from Regis College at the University of Toronto. Today we have 4 speakers for you on this very important topic. This series of special seminars is being organized by program of the Petroyatsik program for the study of contemporary Ukraine at the University of Toronto, coordinated by our 2 co-chairs, Professor Lukin Wei and Dr. Ksenia Kibushinska, and a special thanks to Dr. Olga Kesarchuk and Larissa Yurovenko, who are doing the administrative side of these webinars, all the work behind the scenes that goes into making these things happen. So thank you very much, and thank you for joining us. We have 4 speakers today, so I will introduce them in sequence. Each speaker will speak for 5 to 10 minutes, and then we will throw the floor open to questions. Please post your questions in the chat function and direct the question to a speaker or say that this is open to all speakers. I apologize if I look a little tired. I've already been on a panel in London, England very early this morning, organized by the Institute of Historical Research. So this is my second seminar today, but here we go. Professor Yaroslav Skira, who organized this panel and invited all of these experts to speak to us today, is an associate professor of historical theology at Regis College, a fellow at the Sheptytsky Institute of Eastern Christian Studies, the University of St. Michael's College at the University of Toronto, and also a member of the coordinating committee of the Yatsik program, which is bringing this seminar to you. His research interests include modern Orthodox theology, ecumenical relations between Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches. Professor Skira, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Dichok. A special thank you to the Yatsik program, and as well as the Munk School and the Sheptytsky Institute, who are all co-sponsors of this. And this follows a number of successful events we've had in the past, particularly dealing with the autocephaly of the church in Ukraine back to 2018. Obviously, I speak from a faculty member in a North American university in the West, and so my thoughts and my prayers are with all of those people suffering in Ukraine through the senseless violence. The civilian death toll is staggering. And the displacement of peoples internally and refugees is just unbelievable. 1 in every 4 Ukrainians is a refugee or displaced. So imagine moving a country the size, a population the size of Greece or Belgium, or that of American state like New Jersey or Michigan. That's just the sheer toll of that violence. When I teach history courses at the university, I always look for contemporary relevance of past historic events. And one of the images that came to mind were how the early Christians were persecuted, and they went into the catacombs to pray and to bury their dead. And in looking at the events in Ukraine, I see a similar parallel happening. What happens is that we have a number of the communities that are forced into bomb shelters and in basements. And so the churches and the church leaders have been preaching as if these were people in the catacombs. So a person like Patriarch Sviatoslav Shevchuk, who is the primate of the Ukrainian Greco-Catholic Church, posts daily video messages of pastoral care for his faithful. They always begin with the identical phrases. He addresses, first he says, "Glory be to Jesus Christ," which is a traditional Christian greeting for Eastern Christians. He addresses his brothers and sisters in Christ, and he always adds this haunting phrase, "Today is the Xth day of the war in Ukraine." And each message ends the same way, with a prayer that that Almighty God, eternal, protect Ukraine for us. Metropolitan Epiphany of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine similarly has used social media to engage in pastoral care and send messages of hope to his people. He often will live stream liturgies and vespers and matins from the historic Golden Dome Church in central Kyiv, a city that is being bombarded currently by Russian forces. And even Metropolitan Onufry of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate has come out and condemned the war and asked for the Patriarch Kirill of the Russian Orthodox Church in Moscow to intervene. Almost 3 weeks after the war began, and for his failure to condemn the war, we've seen more than half of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church eparchies in Ukraine essentially censure the Moscow Church and to cease liturgically commemorating Kirill. Ukraine is also, in addition to having kind of a dominant Eastern Christian population of Orthodox and Eastern Catholic churches, it also is religiously pluralist. The Ukrainian Council of Churches and Religious Organizations, composed of Jewish, Muslim, Orthodox, and Catholics and Baptists, among others, has come out and formally condemned the war and its indiscriminate bombardment and killing of civilians and structures, and has advocated for humanitarian assistance. Even Ukraine's President Zelensky, who is of Jewish descent, has appealed and communicated with Ukraine's chief rabbi and receiving a response and prayers of the chief rabbi condemning the war and offering prayers for Ukraine. Other Christian bodies have also reacted to the war in Ukraine. For example, the World Council of Churches acting secretary, Ioan Saucha, who is himself an Orthodox, a Romanian Orthodox, has appealed to the Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, Patriarch Kirill, to intervene and to end the vast suffering and loss of life and to secure peace in Ukraine. Although, interestingly, he doesn't name Russia as the aggressor in his appeal. Pope Francis has also issued a number of statements against the war in Ukraine, though some have lamented that he had not come out sooner in condemning the war. He had visited the ambassadors' residences in Rome, which broke papal protocol at the start of the war. He had dispatched a number of cardinals to Ukraine to report and to assist in any way. One of those was Cardinal Michael Czerny, who is well known for his advocacy for refugees. And Cardinal Czerny has also expressed concern for human trafficking and for the thousands of students, foreign students who are also trapped in Ukraine. Pope Francis often will have his Sunday Angelus, his Sunday message to his communities. And in the most recent one, he condemned the war and the senseless massacre and the abhorrent war in Ukraine. In his video conference with Patriarch Kirill not too long ago, the press releases from coming out of the Vatican were clearly condemning the war. But the press releases that are from the Russian Orthodox Church completely whitewashed the event and refused to call it a war. Instead, used kind of the language that is now common in Russian propaganda of conflict and crisis in Ukraine. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, also reached out to Patriarch Kirill of the Russian Orthodox Church for him to intervene with the Russian state to end the war. One of the other important things is a number of leading Orthodox scholars had issued a declaration. This is, for me, a major statement. In this declaration, they condemned the Russian world ideology that has been promoted by Patriarch Kirill and that has been weaponized by the Russian state. Essentially, it promotes an ethnophilitism or an ethno-nationalism of a pan-Russian empire. So something that would be well known in North America, white supremacism, this is in fact a form of Russian supremacism. And in speaking of the spiritual unity of the peoples of Ukraine and Russia and Belarus, that actually becomes a dog whistle, which literally means that all these peoples should not have any distinct identities, and in fact should all be Russians and be part of this Russian world. Some people have come out and condemned the fact that Patriarch Kirill has been silent about condemning the war in Ukraine. But for me, that's the wrong question and the wrong issue. It's based on the premise that he is morally innocent in all of this. What is the real question is, why has he promoted this Russian supremacism of this Russian world ideology that has led to the war? Raphael Lemkin was one of the first to coin the term genocide. And Raphael Lemkin basically said genocide is not constituted by simply one single act. It is a series of events and acts that leads to the eradication of peoples, a distinct civic identity of peoples. And it is a series of acts that are geared toward the elimination of their future self-determination. And in this way, I think that I would say that any one of those Russian Orthodox leaders and anyone in the political sphere who promotes such a Russian world ideology is complicit in genocide. And that genocide is in the vilification and the demonization and the marginalization of any non-Russian churches in Ukraine. That would include the Ukrainian Greco-Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. It would essentially, in Christian terms, say that all those people are going to hell, they're subject to damnation. These church leaders function as a form of religious soft power, both locally and internationally, and dealing with public dignitaries. And in many ways, they've collaborated with the Russian state in promoting this Russian world ideology. If the evil of this kind of Russian supremacism is allowed to triumph in Ukraine, let alone continue to exist in Russia, the world will embark on another dark period of human history of confessors and martyrs like the early church. We need to, for me, to follow that prophetic witness of those Ukrainians, particularly those Ukrainian church leaders which condemned this violence, and we need to support them in anything that promotes human flourishing and Christ's command to love one's neighbor. We need to act and pray so that we could never have to invoke such imagery of catacombs and bomb shelters. We need to seek the liberation and the freedom of peoples of Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Skira. Our next speaker is Father Professor Cyril Hovurun. He's a professor of ecclesiology, international relations, and ecumenism, interesting combination, at University College Stockholm. Professor Hovurun is a graduate of the Theological Academy in Kyiv and the National University in Athens, and his PhD is from Durham University. He was the chairman of the Department of External Church Relations of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, first deputy chairman of the Educational Committee of the Russian Orthodox Church, later a research fellow at Yale and Columbia Universities. He's been visiting professor at the University of Munster in Germany, international fellow at the Center for the Study of Religion and Public Life at the University of Alberta, director of Huffington Ecumenical Institute at Loyola Marymount University, and assistant professor at that same university. He has published numerous books in several languages. His latest one is in Italian, so I hope I pronounce this. Don't mangle it too badly. La riconciliazione della memoria, ricordare della separazione tra la Chiesa e la Ricerca della Unità, published in Rome in 2021, just last year, co-authored with Lothar Vogel and Stefano Calvato. In 2019, he published Sacred Architecture in East and West and various other publications. Professor Hovurun, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me with you. And I'd like to pick up Professor Skira's conversation about this Russian world ideology, and to elaborate on this, because I should say that I witnessed this ideology being born, being conceived, being born, and being nourished within the Russian Orthodox Church. I may say that I saw this ideology being a baby cooing, in a cradle, until it developed into a monster which kills people nowadays. And I firmly believe that this ideology is really the kind of intellectual or ideological frame for the Russian war. For me, the formula of the war is very simple. It's guns plus ideas. The guns have been supplied by the Kremlin, and the ideas, unfortunately, have been supplied by the church. Well, it doesn't mean that we need to blame religion per se, because I can anticipate, like, the accusations coming from the secular circles. Oh, again, this religion, again, it is to be blamed for the war. No, it's not exactly. It's not the religious war in the classical sense. What we are dealing with is a secularized version of religion, where religion, where the agent of secularization is the church per se. This is a very strange phenomenon described by the sociologists of religion, when sometimes the agents of religion become the subjects of secularization of religion. The churches promote kind of secularization of religion, and we deal with this. We face this situation in the modern Russian church. When the Russian church, through its speakers, including Patriarch Kirill, adopt the language, for example, of traditional values, which is familiar to all of us. This language of traditional values is nothing more than a secular substitute for religious language. It's essentially, well, to use the phrase of the famous Canadian sociologist of religion, Charles Taylor, there is a secular frame. So essentially, what we are facing in the case of the Russian world, it's a product of a secular frame, which had been adopted by the Russian Orthodox Church to articulate an ideology which would appeal, to the masses of secularized Russians that emerged out of the Soviet Union as a result of the deep disappointment in the communist ideology. They were offered a substitute in the form of the Russian world. So essentially, the Russian world is nothing more than but a substitute, ideological substitute for the bankrupted communist ideology. I believe that the idea of the church to promote this ideology was to use it as an instrument of evangelization of the people. In other words, to fill the ideological gap with some Christian messages mixed up with, the ideological topics, ideological tropes from both monarchical ideology before the Russian Revolution and the communist ideology. So the Russian world is a syncretic doctrine, essentially, which combines elements of different imperial and quasi-imperial ideologies. The old Russian, like a kind of classical imperial ideology on the one hand, on the other hand, the Soviet ideology, and plus the post-Soviet ideologies that include a lot of kind of post-Soviet myths, and include this kind of mixture also has a very strong religious component in it. So this mixture was used by the church in order to attract, millions of people, Russians, to the church. That was the idea. But what happened instead, that this ideology essentially poisoned the church with an ideology which is profoundly aligned to Christianity, to the Orthodox Christianity. And that's why we are dealing with an alienation of the doctrine, which is dominant within the Russian church. That's why we call it heresy. And I think this is exactly the language which was used in the declaration against the Russian world, which was mentioned already. And I think it is an important document because it's really describing this ideology as a heresy in the terms of the heresy. It is heresy because it is a distortion of the original Christian message. So this ideological frame indeed constitutes the it is the intellectual engine, if you want, or metaphysical engine of the war. It inspires people to go and fight in Ukraine, and it certainly needs to be deconstructed. That's why I envisage as a next step in or in dealing with this war, in order to prevent it happening again. So to make it never happen again, we need to deconstruct this ideological framework of this war. Essentially, we theologians, especially from the East, theologians coming from the Eastern Christian traditions, I think we need to join our efforts in deconstructing this ideology in the same way as the Western theologians after the World War II had deconstructed the theologies, I call them totalitarian theologies, that underpinned the Nazi and fascist regimes. There were such theologies. They were particularly popular in the 1930s, and then after the World War II, they were deconstructed successfully. A symbol of this deconstruction has become a theology branded as theology after Auschwitz. We need something like that in the Eastern Christianity, a theology after the Ukrainian war, for example. And this theology should embrace other missed opportunities for us as theologians to address the issues of the past. Like we Ukrainians, I should say, we have preserved a very kind of strong memories about the Holodomor. And of course, it is a very important issue for us, Holodomor. But as theologians, we fail to produce a theology after Holodomor. And I think we need to catch up with that, and we need to do something about that. And now this war in Ukraine is an opportunity to address not just the war as such, this war as such, but also its predecessors. Because we can say that Holodomor was a predecessor of this war. We can say that, in a sense, the genocides against the Orthodox populations, like in the Ottoman Empire, against the Armenians, the Syrians, the Greeks, it was also a predecessor of the genocide that we are facing nowadays. And we in the Eastern Christianity have not produced a theology after the genocide, something that we need to do right now. So that is my appeal. If you want, my appeal is, if we want to do something about this war, if we want to make it if we want it never repeat again, then we need really to smash, to destroy the foundation, the ideological foundation of this war. And this is a very important task for the theologians who work in the field of the public and political theology. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Our next speaker is Professor Nagia Kitsenko, Professor of History and Director of Religious Studies at the State University of New York at Albany. She earned her BA at Harvard and Radcliffe in History and Literature, and her PhD in History at Columbia University. I have a very long biography here, but Professor Kitsenko said, let's just get to the main thing. So I would really like to mention she's written a number of award-winning articles and books. Her latest, published in 2021 by Oxford University Press, Good for the Souls, A History of Confession in the Russian Empire. Professor Kitsenko, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Those of us who are on the panel today did not know exactly what the others were going to be speaking about. So before I begin, I would actually like to have a little bit of a transition with what Father Kirill just said. Indeed, the heresy of ethnophilitism, the church-state smychka that the Greeks condemned when the Bulgarians sought independence in the 19th century, has been a curse for many an Orthodox nation. So we are quite right to focus on it and to say, of course, this is easy to say from the perspective of North America, that maybe church-state separation is indeed the way to go. However, I'm going to be speaking about something different, something more focused within Ukraine than on the forces outside of it. And that is the title of this panel, which is to say the churches and the Russian war on Ukraine. It is indeed churches in the plural, and it is indeed the Russian war. Precisely because we're using the plural, I would like to include a group that many seem to have forgotten or want to forget, the part of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church that continues to commemorate Kirill Patriarch of Moscow. I know it's more exciting and more rewarding to think about, let's say, Metropolitan Onufri, who is finally named Russia and Putin by name. It's more exciting to look at the maps we've seen this morning showing the 15 Ukrainian eparchies no longer commemorating Kirill. But what about the Ukrainian eparchies that are still commemorating, even nearly 4 weeks into the invasion? And what does that tell us about the future of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church? About a week ago, we started seeing all of these posts and emails about how the UOC will now join the OCU, just like that. But I don't know about that. If we haven't seen a wave of UOC bishops and priests going to the OCU now in the thick of this dreadful, horrendous war, why would they do so after the war? It might seem as if with Russia attacking Ukraine, that would be the clincher. That was indeed the case for the diocese whose priests I know best, that of Sumy, but it is not so for many others, even now. Why? Part of it may be the person of Onufri himself. We should not underestimate the degree to which his priests genuinely admire him. Many did not switch jurisdictions out of a respect for him personally, whereas they regard Metropolitan Epifani, fairly or not, as the creature of Filaret and weak. So the personal factor is a part of it. But there are other reasons holding UOC clerics and hierarchs back, some ideological, some liturgical. 2014 already made it difficult to reconcile the radically different constituencies within the UOC. Some regarded themselves as Ukrainian patriots and insisted on the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Others backed the Donbass separatists. In 2018, with the establishment of the OCU and the departure of some clerics for whom Ukrainian identity was key, the UOC was left with a higher than before proportion of those with an all Rus identification. It had to maintain the balancing of multiple constituencies. For the OCU, it was simpler. As long as one is loyal to Epifani and the cause of Ukrainian liturgical autocephaly, there is a wide range of flexibility and room for individual variety. There being several translations into Ukrainian as opposed to one canonical one for the liturgy, the larger number of clerics and laity involved in ecumenical initiatives, all this meant more liturgical experimentation on the part of the OCU before the war. Their attitude to the past was selective, their attitude to the present one of tolerant latitude, and their attitude to the future was expansive. So in this sense, before the war, the OCU seemed to be evolving in the overall direction of the Paris Exarchate in the 1920s to the 1950s, the OCA, the Orthodox Church of America, in the 1960s, 1970s, or in its emphasis on nation building and secular memory culture on the contemporary Estonian Apostolic Orthodox Church. Whereas the UOC's overall liturgical practice could have been described as being conservative, emphasizing ceremony and hierarchy. They saw Church Slavonic as a link to their own liturgical tradition, not one imposed on them by outsiders. Even as some of them acknowledged the heavy hand of St. Petersburg and Moscow, they did not reject the role of those places in Ukrainian church history, whether in Rus, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, or of independent Ukraine. So before the war, the UOC's attitude to the past was inclusive, their attitude to the present conservationist, and their attitude to the future cautious. In this sense, they could be compared to the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese in America with its maintenance of liturgical Greek, the Estonian Orthodox Church in communion with the Moscow Patriarchate, or the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia. That, again, is before the war. What now? Here, a crucial figure is Arsenii, Metropolitan of the Svetohirsk Lavra. Even when the Lavra was shelled a few days ago, sending hundreds of refugees and monks into the monastery cellars, Arsenii addressed only those responsible in his appeal, not Putin, not the Russian army. In his sermon yesterday on St. Gregory Palamas and the saints of the Kievo-Pecherskaya Lavra, Arseny chose to emphasize the role of the cave saints as a unifying force for those who did not want to leave their homeland in any circumstances, even during a fratricidal civil war, 1918 to 1921, even when Antoni Hrapavitsky wanted to take those relics with him to Serbia. I was especially struck by Arseny's account of the Second World War. There, Arseny noted, many different nationalities fought on the side of Hitler: Italians, Hungarians, the French. Interestingly, he left out the Ukrainians and the Russians who fought on the side of Hitler, but more on that another time. And Arseny noted that they were mostly Catholics. But even then, he emphasized, they did not stop commemorating the Pope. Even though Spain was fighting France, France was fighting Italy. Despite all the craziness of secular politicians, Catholic churches in all countries continued to commemorate the Pope. If the Catholics could act like this when faced with Hitler, Metropolitan Arseny asked rhetorically, why all the proposals to stop commemorating now? He argued it was more imperative to maintain the unity of the church in the face of political turmoil. Now, he mentioned saints like Amphilochi of Pochayev, Kuksha of Odessa, Lavrency of Chernihiv. All of them left the same testament, he said, that of unity. I don't think I need to deconstruct this argument point by point, nor do I need to comment on Metropolitan Arseny saying that Gregory of Palamas was like our Serhiy of Radonezh. I mention all of this only to underline that the all-Rus identifying hierarchy in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is still here. And this is the kind of language that they are using. And based on the comments in the Svetohirsk feed, they still have some support. So to conclude, before the Russian invasion, the UOC-OCU divide showed itself in language, in ideology, and in liturgy. With the war, Patriarch Kirill's continued embrace of the attack on Ukraine by the Russian state has placed him beyond the pale to an increasing number of people in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, but not all. Metropolitan Epiphany himself has finally stopped commemorating Patriarch Kirill in the Great Entrance during the liturgies. He was commemorating the Patriarch as recently as 3 weeks ago. Clearly, Kirill has used up what sympathy he got among some Orthodox churches after 2018. Finally, since we are talking about the churches and the war, let us remember that whatever the outcome of the war, whatever happens to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church hierarchs who have staked out a clear position, whether that of Yevlogy Sumsky or Arseny of Svetohirsk, what's left of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church will have a new, less inclusive, less expansive profile. It can't have it all. And the Russian Orthodox Church will be smaller and more isolated after the war, as in fact it is already. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our final speaker today is Dr. Pawlo Smitsniuk. He is the director of the Institute of Ecumenical Studies and a senior lecturer at the Ukrainian Catholic University UKU in Lviv. Pawlo studied philosophy and theology in Rome, Athens, and St. Petersburg, holds a doctorate from the University of Oxford. His main research interests are political theology, Russian Orthodoxy, nationalism, religion, as well as colonial studies. Professor Smitsniuk, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marta, and thank you for the invitation to speak at this panel with people whom I respect very profoundly and like. It is sort of challenging to be the last one to speak, and I have reduced my paper, I think, by 90%, but still try to do with the 10 remaining percent as well as I can. I would like to speak a little bit about how this war is a challenge for maybe any church in Ukraine. Ukrainian churches have, I think, reacted to the war by trying to be helpful through their charity, through helping the refugees, through their support. Yes, I think by now a quarter of Ukrainian population around 10 million people were forced to leave their homes. And Christian parishes, charities were among the first places who have welcomed people. Various dioceses and institutions provide psychological help to those affected by war. The churches pray. Somebody prays for Ukraine, somebody prays for the victory, somebody prays for the enemies. I think one of the biggest challenge to the church and to the churches in any time, but perhaps especially today in times of war, is to remain church, as to witness to the truth and to help those who are suffering. Now, when one contemplates, yes, the tragedy of this war, when one sees that the war is supported by 70% of the Russian population, yes, the natural temptation is to hate. And in this context, I found important the call by the major archbishop of Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, Sviatoslav Shevchuk, not to hate, but to love. When we hate, we have been already defeated by our enemy. So how has the war affected various churches? How it became a challenge, a test to the churches? Yes, Father Cyril spoke about the Russian Orthodox Church, and I will not then focus on this. It's almost the challenge, do you want to be a church or not? Yes, do you want to be a church or a civil political religion? The war is the challenge for Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Yes, Nadezhda has shown how uneasy it is for this jurisdiction to keep its credibility. It's true that Metropolitan Onufry has condemned the war. It's true that there is no evidence that bishops or parishes are welcoming, the Russian army with flowers. So if they try to convince Ukrainians into the Russian Ruski Mir, they were not very successful. But it's also true that there are too many instances where this church served to Kremlin plans. Yes, Russian world, their anti-Westernism, exaggerated narratives of persecution. So I think what is needed is a recognition, yes, that they were engaged in this theopolitical project. I don't know whether they have enough intellectual resources today to find their way out of the impasse. Yeah, we have precedents mentioned by Nadezhda. We have even more recent precedents during the wars in the Balkans, when a jurisdiction, yes, when you can be a Serbian church commemorating Serbian Patriarch and be in Croatia, or vice versa. It's always difficult, and it always requires to have your hands and your mind and your heart clean. The war is also a challenge to the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. As from the declaration of Metropolitan Epiphany, it seems that this church considers the current situation as also an opportunity to bring to completion the project of the unity of Ukrainian Orthodoxy, which was only partially successful over last years. I think that this church and Ukrainian society as a whole have been acting with a lot of maturity by avoiding attacks on the Moscow Patriarchate parishes. I think that there are only very few cases, and this is very important. There are already a lot of tensions and mistrust between the two jurisdictions, and if the attacks of the parishes happen now, it will be a huge problem. As the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine would prefer to have their own church independent rather than unite with the OCU. The war became a big challenge for Ukrainian Greek Catholics. The Vatican, Pope Francis, have been moving in a way which attracted a lot of attention from the observers abroad and in Ukraine. Yes, maybe there is something happening behind closed doors which justifies the Vatican's caution on Russian aggression in Ukraine. the Vatican prefers discreet diplomacy to loud declaration. Yes, and sometimes these tactics have proven to be effective. Yeah, if you look at the role the Holy See played in healing the breach between the USA and Cuba, 7 years ago. Now, during the current war in Ukraine, the Pope has made several symbolic gestures, as mentioned already by Yaroslav. But, you know, symbolic gestures, symbols are polysemantic. They mean everything and they mean nothing at the same time. Of course, if you want to be a mediator, you need to keep an open channels of communication on both sides and avoid statements that could be interpreted as partisan. But there are moments in which to be partisan could also mean to be silent about the truth on the causes of the war and those who are responsible. In this way, you fail the victims who need protection and encouragement. It would seem that after the first 2 weeks of the war, Pope Francis became more pronounced about the tragedy that Russia has set in motion. However, I think there is a growing discontent among many Ukrainian Catholics and Greek Catholics about the position taken by the Holy See. The Patriarch Sviatoslav Shevchuk was very good at trying to insist, yes, with the Ukrainian public that the Pope is close to Ukrainians and that he is doing a lot, but it's not an easy task. The war has been a challenge to Ukrainian Protestants. The majority of Ukrainian Protestants are Baptists and Pentecostals. Many have traditionally had pacifist positions. Some communities would not know whether or not they can be allowed to support the army or defend the country with the weapons. At the same time, since the Protestants have a very developed inter-community communication, probably better than Ukrainian Orthodox or Greek Catholics, this has allowed to the Protestants to be very quick in launching humanitarian support. Some concluding remarks. The churches in Ukraine are facing a huge challenge to which they are not prepared. In the past, they did not invest in the resources that can help them to deal with social issues, the ethics of war, or peacemaking. There were a number of initiatives, but that has not become a trend, although Ukraine has been in war for at least 8 years. Let me give you an example. Ukraine has a very active council of churches and religious organizations, yes, which unites 16 major religious organizations, Orthodox, Catholics, Protestants, as well as Jews and Muslims. A few months ago, a book with all or almost all statements of the council was published to commemorate the 25th anniversary of the council. Now there you have, I think, 1/3 of documents which are dedicated to protection of family values. 25 documents against gender ideology and state recognition of same-sex marriage, which are presented as a threat to the national security of Ukraine. It was a quote. Less than a dozen documents in totality on injustice, inequality, poverty, migration, ecology. Only 3 documents on peace building and 2 on reconciliation. If one compares this focus on family, sexuality, and reproduction in which our churches have been involved to the space dedicated to questions of peace and social justice, we see an important asymmetry between the former and the later. And I think this also explains why our churches struggle to be prophetic in this moment. Yes, we rightly say that the Russian Orthodox Church can't be prophetic in this moment and only repeats in a theological translation what Putin is saying on a political level. But to a certain degree, this could be said that about the major churches in Ukraine. They struggle to speak with a prophetic voice, to say something different, something that transcends what the government and the rest of society is saying. Yes, they are probably on the right side of the history, unlike the Russian Orthodox Church. But where is the prophetic spirit? Fazil Hovorun, in an essay on Maidan, which I think was published by Toronto Journal of Theology, he said that Maidan was a test to Ukrainian churches. It was more innovative, more ethically challenging than what the churches were ready for. And I'm afraid that today we are in a similar situation. We have seen this with COVID, and we are seeing this now with the war. The last point, which I would like to mention, is that the war is a challenge for the future of ecumenical relations. Russia, yes, has always insisted that it is numerically the biggest Orthodox church, and its voice was important on many issues. That was the question of patriarchate for the Greek Catholic Church, isolation of Kiev Patriarchate from ecumenical movement, from relation with the Catholic churches. We'll see what happens now when Russian Orthodox Church is losing its credibility. Today, there is a chance for the Orthodox Church of Ukraine and for Ukrainian Greek Catholics to play a major role in the ecumenical movement. And as a result, for the ecumenical movement to be less like a G7 club and more like a community of those who really look for unity. Am I being too idealistic? But the time will show. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. That's actually a wonderful note to end on. I'd like to thank all the speakers for your excellent presentations. A lot of information, a lot to think about. I'd like to encourage our audience, if you have any questions, please pose them in the Q&A function, and I will share them with our speakers. While you're thinking of your questions, I will use my prerogative as a chair to pose my own. You all presented very interesting materials from different perspectives. What I did not hear and would be very interested in hearing, or perhaps I missed it, is what is the position of Patriarch Bartholomew in Constantinople? Professor Skira organized a series of fascinating presentations at the Munk School when we could still do this live about Thomas. But I've been hearing this commentary of the Pope, and I completely agree with what Professor Smitsnuk was just saying, that he's making statements, you can interpret them differently, but what is Patriarch Bartholomew saying? I would just unmute yourself and jump in. I'm not gonna, you don't have to raise your hand. So Professor, please go ahead. Just anybody at any time, just jump in.
Thank you. If I could impose myself to answer this question first, because I had the chance to see Patriarch Bartholomew recently in Constantinople and had a chance to discuss with him the war in private. And yes, we know his public statements. He continues publishing his appeals for peace and condemnations of the war. And also he has a personal kind of attitude, which I had a chance to witness, and I should say, should properly reveal to this audience that I was very much impressed by the degree of his personal involvement in this war, to his empathy that he really feels, you know, to the Ukrainian people. I had the chance to see quite a few religious leaders, you know, and people during this period of time. And sometimes you can guess who is saying something because he is or she is supposed to say, or because he or she feels like that. I would say that Patriarch Bartholomew certainly is in profound empathy with the sufferings of the Ukrainian people, and he speaks up. I would argue that he's probably the most outspoken religious leader so far on the war in Ukraine. Even if we compare his standpoint with, you know, with the standpoint of the Vatican, it's not, you know, to counterpose, or, you know, to counterpose one against the other. It's just to underline the important role that the ecumenical patriarchate plays in the Orthodox community, but also in addressing the issues of the war.
Thank you. So perhaps this is more a question that his messages aren't making it into the international media in the same way that the Pope's statements are. I don't know, would that be an accurate read from what you just answered?
Yeah, sometimes he addresses pockets of audiences. Like I think his strongest statement was made in his interview on CNN Turk in Turkish language. It has been translated, of course, but certainly it has a very limited outreach.
Did anybody else?
Yeah,
Please,
if I
go
can
ahead.
just add, Professor Dishok, George Demokopoulos published an article recently in Commonweal magazine, and he gives you a listing of all of the Orthodox Church responses to this, and Patriarch Bartholomew is certainly at the forefront of explicitly naming the war. So the naming of the reality is a very important and ethical choice. By not naming it as a war, it's really a moral failure. But anyway, Demokopoulos in this magazine, it's called Commonweal magazine, has a list, and he says the Orthodox responses have ranged from the ridiculous, the generic, the strident, and the surprising. And so he faults for some of the churches for not speaking out more against the war. But he also singles out those who actually have been exercising those prophetic voices.
There's a question in the chat from Nicholas, and forgive me if I mispronounce your name, Chrysidis. The question is not addressed to any particular speaker, so anybody can answer it. As a historian, metaphysical concepts such as the Russian world make me extremely uncomfortable in and of themselves, but especially so when they're inserted into messianic Manichaean statements such as the ones that purport to define it by, excuse me, clergymen and laymen alike. The matter is political, of course, hence my question. How can the Russian Church's attachment be condemned when each and every Orthodox church is national or aspires to be? Why is the boogeyman of ethnophilitism resurrected? I'm not sure I pronounced that properly. Who would like to tackle that
one? I would like to address one part of it. I think that since Father Kirill raised the issue of Russian world, he should certainly weigh in on this, because the question is attached to him. But since I mentioned philitism, I can comment on that. I think if I understand Professor Chrysidis' question correctly, indeed, one of the problems with the document condemning the Russian world, which Professor Havarun alluded to, is that it used the term heresy, which is problematic, not because ethnophilitism was not declared a heresy, but because normally the Orthodox Church, and here I'm thinking like a historian, not a theologian, I could be wrong on this, but as far as I know, the Orthodox Church has tended to use the term heresy. It has been church councils that define heresy, not documents signed by people who are not all Orthodox even. So it's just that it seems strange to me to see a document calling the Russian world a heresy, which is signed by people who are not all theologians and who are not all Orthodox. So that's a separate problem, but it's a problem. I mean, my small answer to Dr. Chrysidis would be that, of course, the problem is when one nation attacks another. And of course, yes, two countries both being Orthodox, that has never stopped Orthodox countries from attacking one another. We need only think of the First Balkan War or the Second Balkan War with Greece and Bulgaria and Serbia and Romania all duking it out among one another. But it seems to me that in this particular case, Patriarch Kirill kind of brought it upon himself partly by the background to the war, and then when the war began, not walking back from it, but doubling down on it. That might perhaps be a start. But I absolutely take the broader point, Dr. Chrysidis.
If I may add to this, that I agree that we should be cautious in pointing out where is heresy and where is not. I personally believe that there is a heretical component in this doctrine, because heresy, I would define heresy as an obstacle raised between a human being and God, or an idol, if you want, that substitutes God. And certainly the Russian world is somehow idolatrous, because it substitutes like the kingdom of God with this Russian civilization. It certainly substitutes, Christ's love with traditional values, and you name it. The list is quite long. Also, I agree that it is the Russian world is just a case among many other cases in the Orthodox ecumene, the cases of exceptionism, when either an ethnos or an imagined civilization or any social group, any group of peoples ascribe to themselves some exceptional messianic role in the history. And certainly this is the case of Russia nowadays, but it's not only the case of Russia. I would name also, for example, the Greek Megalia idea, the Greek great idea that had also very catastrophic, literally, consequences for the Greek people in Asia Minor. And essentially, the Russian world is the Russian Megali idea, in a sense, great idea, with, well, apparently the same or even worse catastrophic consequences for the Russian world as such. Certainly, the Russian world is the most brutal, the most murderous version of ethnophilitism that the Orthodox world ever knew. But it's not a completely new thing. It's just the most extremal form of ethnophilitism so far.
Thank you. I don't see any other questions in the chat, so let me ask another question that was running through my mind as I was listening. I don't remember hearing anything about humanitarian side of things. You focus more on the theological and ideas. Is there a role that churches in Ukraine are playing in this humanitarian process, in addition to the spiritual tending to the flock, as it were?
If I may start, I think that certainly the churches are working a lot with the refugees. And you have millions of people moving around, and it's, I think, coordinated ecumenically, also internationally. So Ukrainian churches receive a lot of help that can be then given to the refugees, and also I think Poland, Hungary, Romania, often the refugees will be welcomed by the church structures, or supported by the money that is coming from the church. Even the Holy See tried to express its support of Ukraine in a humanitarian way, yes, by sending 2 cardinals who deal with humanitarian aid, not a secretary of the state. Yes, so it means that even there the focus is less political, more humanitarian. But there are many issues, I think, where the churches probably haven't made their voice heard. And I think we had an issue, for example, of African students who struggle to leave the country. And the churches intervened, I think, at the very end, but they didn't know how to approach this. And there were very, very simple solutions for that. The same with pictures of the prisoners of war and videos of prisoners of war that have been distributed, but you needed more discretion. So I think the challenge for our churches now is also to learn how to behave in the time of, yes, armored conflict, and to build up as quickly as possible, this expertise.
Thank you. We have about 2 minutes left, and 2 of our speakers would still like to speak. What I'd like to propose is that we can run a little bit over time, and those of you in the audience who need to rush off to your next appointment, please feel free to do so. Before I hand over, because I'd like to have everybody speak, a public service announcement. The Patriarchate program continues to hold seminars. The next 2 will be, there's one on Wednesday, March the 13th, and it is War in Ukraine, Jewish Perspectives from the Ground in Ukraine and Beyond. And then on Friday, there will be a Battle for Ukraine's Past. So I encourage you to sign up and attend those. And now, Professor Kitsanko, you're...
Thanks, Martha, for asking the question, and Pavloa, the direction that you took in answering it, because indeed, human rights is a very important category. Humanitarian aid is an important category. And I think actually it would be helpful for us when we think about the variety of crimes that are being committed on Ukraine's soil now, in Ukraine now. It's useful to think about what are the differences and what are the most useful terms. Crimes against humanity, war crimes, human rights violations.
Genocide.
Genocide also, but the point is they're not interchangeable terms. And therefore, I think that it's very useful for us because our emotional reactions on all our parts when we see what's happening there are so strong that it's useful to try to come back to the definitions and say, okay, is this a crime against humanity? Is it a genocide? What's the difference? And what is more useful? And I just wanted to say one very small thing about humanitarian aid, that the priests that I know in Sumy Diocese who were involved in charitable work with homebound people, etc., have now turned all of their supplies, including an old minivan, to the service of the Ukrainian Defense Army. You know, the idea being that sometimes you have to save the nation and then save the people as well. But that is all I will say at the moment.
Thank you, Professor Skira.
Yes, I was just going to add to the issue of humanitarian work. You know, you could see a number of the churches and institutions like Ukrainian Catholic University and the University in Lviv. They set up dormitories for refugees. That's one example, but a lot of that humanitarian work has been ongoing since the war started, actually in 2014. And so if you look at a number of the websites, you see this charitable works to those people who have been displaced from the Donbass, both within and outside. One of the ones I just recently saw was humanitarian work promoted by the Orthodox Church, by the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, and some humanitarian assistance. So there are numerous examples of that. That just perhaps there'll be one day a study to show the extent of that or its effectiveness, and whether it's that humanitarian work only goes to certain groups of people or whether it's universally accessible by all.
Thank you. Was there anybody else who wanted to come in on this? We have officially now gone overtime, so we should probably wrap up. I would like to thank all of the speakers. Fascinating presentations. I certainly learned a lot and walking away with even more questions. Thank you to our audience for tuning in. Thank you to the organizers, and hope to see you. Oh, another question popped up. Oh, that was just a thank you from everybody. So thank you, everybody. Hope to see you at more of our events in the future. And also a shout out, I'm doing this all the time. Everybody in each university, do what you can to assist refugee scholars and students. We have institutional mechanisms in place to bring in scholars. So go to those international departments, find that money, and let's help those students and scholars. Thank you.